It really makes you stop and think how certain accusations just keep popping up through history, doesn't it?
It really does.
You shared some fascinating stuff, and one thing that really grabbed me was this recurring charge of crazed orgies. You see it leveled against groups seen as a threat. I
Mm.
mean, from Brazilian indigenous people right when gold was discovered on their lands,
Mhm.
all the way to Marie Antoinette, before the French Revolution, getting smeared with tales of orgiastic excesses.
Yeah,
It's a pretty wild pattern, really. Makes you wonder what's actually going on behind those claims.
absolutely. And what's really fascinating is how long this tactic has lasted. Accusing your enemies of sexual deviancy.
Right.
It seems to tap into something really fundamental, a way to, demonize and marginalize anyone challenging the established order. And like your sources show, this isn't just ancient history.
Exactly. And it seems to get, well, particularly intense when society gets anxious about young people. The material you sent mentioned those moral panics, maybe a couple of decades back,
Yeah.
about rainbow parties and daisy
Oh,
chains,
yeah. I remember those
these
stories.
supposed widespread teenage group sex things. And it's just striking how fast those stories blew up, how they were framed as like proof of national moral collapse.
Yes, and if you connect that to the bigger picture,
Mm.
well, these anxieties about youth sexuality often mirror deeper societal unease, don't they? About the future, maybe a perceived loss of control.
Hmm.
The sources rightly point out that, sex researchers at the time were pretty skeptical about how common these rainbow parties actually were.
Right.
And now they're mostly seen as urban legends. Really shows how easily these panics can catch on, right? Fueled by media, underlying anxieties.
It was almost a relief, actually, to see the source material also bring up the Le Skins parties, London, France, inspired by that TV show Skins.
Ah,
Compared to the hysteria around the other examples, it
yeah.
almost seems, well, mild. The idea that it was mostly teens just cavorting in little more than their underwear, maybe some kissing,
Right.
but not necessarily, the full-on orgies people imagine, especially when you contrast that with actual swingers clubs. It's an interesting difference.
It really is. And that contrast, I think, is key. It suggests these moral panics aren't always about the specific sex acts themselves,
Ah.
but more about who is doing them and the social context. The fear around teenagers doing this stuff is often way more intense than similar activities among, say, consenting adults.
Okay, so let's unpack that idea a bit more. These orgy stories, these accusations, they reveal the fears of the powerful. What kind of fears are we talking about exactly?
Well, the sources specifically mention fears of political subversion, resistance, and dissent.
Okay.
Think about it. If you accuse a group of sexual depravity, you're not just hitting their personal morals. You're basically suggesting they're chaotic, untrustworthy, a fundamental threat to social order, to political order.
Ah, I agree.
That can be a really, really effective way to delegitimize any challenge they might pose to the people in charge.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like saying, look, these people can't even control their basic urges. How can we possibly trust them to govern themselves or challenge our authority?
Precisely. And Hugh Urban's argument really backs this up. He suggests that throughout history, even groups known for being ascetic,
Like self-denial, strict discipline.
exactly, even those groups were sometimes attacked for these imaginary crimes of sexual license. Why? Simply because they challenged the dominant social or religious order.
Wow.
It wasn't about what they were actually doing necessarily, but about the threat they represented symbolically to existing power structures.
It feels almost like a classic case of projection. The elites may be accusing others of the excesses they fear themselves or fear in terms of social upheaval.
Or it's a way to divert attention, as the
Yeah.
sources suggest, away from the real political, social, or economic agendas maybe driving the conflict, or away from the racism, classism, sexism that might be going on. Focus on the sensational sex stuff, and the real issues get obscured.
And the example of the Bacchanalia in Rome that really drives it home. The story we usually hear focuses on, you know, massive orgies, ritual murders. That's
Right.
why they were suppressed.
The sensational version.
But the sources hint it might have been much more political. Maybe the Senate was worried about women gaining leadership roles, or the fact that poor people and slaves were included in these ceremonies.
That's a crucial point the sources raise. I mean, if these cults were really having secret mass orgies and murders on that scale, how could they possibly have stayed secret for so long?
Good point.
The political challenge they pose, their social inclusivity, upsetting gender roles that likely played a much bigger role in their suppression than the juicy stories about sexual excess that got passed down.
Okay, so we've seen how this, like, sensationalized image of orgies has been used politically. But what about the reality of group sex today? The sources you shared started painting a very different picture, something beyond just, chaotic abandon.
Yeah, what's really striking is the level of social organization you find in many contemporary group sex settings.
Mm.
The word orgy might make you think of just complete chaos,
Yeah.
right? But for many people involved, the reality includes a surprising amount of structure and a big emphasis on respecting boundaries.
The security measures alone sounded pretty intense, more like a private club, not some wild free-for-all. You mentioned guest lists, ID checks, even
Yeah.
recording license plates.
Right. And strict bans on phones, cameras outside certain areas.
Wow, sounds serious.
It is. And these measures, they aren't just practical. They point to this interesting tension, right? People are doing something outside the norm,
Yeah.
but they really value discretion, control over their image, safety. It suggests this level of intention, risk management that totally contradicts the wild orgy stereotype.
And the physical setups, too. Designated rooms, themed playrooms, doors you can open or close. It sounds like managing the environment, giving people options for privacy or voyeurism.
Exactly. It's deliberate.
It really does challenge that image of just total
Yeah.
abandon. It sounds like, okay, some mainstream rules are being broken, obviously, but there's still a really strong sense of etiquette, respect among participants.
Very much so.
The source even said assuming everyone wants your sexual charms is a quick way to get your orgy pass revoked. That says a lot about the expectations inside these groups.
Totally. There's this fundamental understanding that consent and boundaries are crucial, even if those boundaries are maybe more fluid than in everyday life.
Right.
And the example of experienced swingers spotting newbies easily, or how someone might disrupt things by acting like it's a normal encounter, like professing love after just meeting someone.
Yeah, probably not the place.
Right. It really shows there are these often unspoken rules, social norms within that specific community. You can't just walk in and act like you're on a first date.
It's almost like there's a specific orgy culture, maybe, with its own do's and don'ts.
That's a good way to put it.
Even, and this is a chilling thought, but even in the context of something horrific like gang rapes, the source mentioned this ordered mayhem. Victim selection, turn-taking, it's awful. But it still points to some kind of structure, even in chaos.
It does. It shows that even in, extreme cases of sexual violence, there can be organizing principles, whether they come from the wider culture or get established within a specific group. It just highlights how complex the interplay is between desire, group dynamics, and social norms, even in the most transgressive acts.
Okay, so we've looked at the history the propaganda uses
Yeah.
and the sort of organized reality of some contemporary practices. Let's get into the why. What are some of the key motivations, the meanings people find in group sex?
Well, the sources touch on a few key areas. One is pretty straightforward. Sensation-seeking, novelty.
Right, the thrill of something different.
Yeah, and the fact that historically, wealthy, powerful people have often been involved in sexually adventurous stuff.
Well, it suggests that for some, that desire for new, intense experiences is a big motivator.
And maybe opportunity and resources play a role, too.
Absolutely. Opportunity, resources, maybe less fear of consequences for some.
It's that idea of pushing boundaries, isn't it? Especially if you feel you have the freedom to. The source also mentioned the Coolidge effect.
Yes, habituation.
That biological thing where you lose interest in a familiar partner over time because the stimulus is repeated.
Mm-hmm. A decrease in response. It makes a certain intuitive sense biologically, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
So the Coolidge effect suggests there might be a biological basis, in some contexts anyway, for seeking novelty in sexual partners. And that could definitely feed into interest in group sex scenarios where you have new partners available.
And then the evolutionary theories. Sperm competition. That got pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's a more debated area. The reference to that practice of bombari among the Marindanum, where multiple men would have sex with one woman quickly as a possible human example.
It's provocative.
It is, but it's also really important to remember the complexities here and the counter-arguments to purely evolutionary explanations.
Like what?
Well, like the source points out, huge cultural variations exist in how these things are viewed. And the asymmetry you see in, say, gangbang torn, way more depictions of multiple guys, one woman that raises questions too. It's clearly not just simple biology driving everything.
Right. And Terry Gould's idea about swinging,
Mm-hmm.
trying to creatively combine different urges, like sperm competition, maybe female bisexuality, like in bonobos, male voyeurism, but all within this framework of emotional fidelity.
Yeah, that felt like a much more nuanced take, didn't it? Trying to integrate the biological and the social.
Gould's perspective tries to synthesize these different factors, suggesting swinging can be a unique outlet for a bunch of human desires, but within a specific cultural setup. And that emphasis on keeping the emotional fidelity in the main couple relationship, that's a really key difference from more anonymous group sex.
Okay. So moving beyond biology, the idea of sexual revolution came up too, like challenging negative attitudes about sex, restrictive practices. It can lead to individual liberation, even a better civilization. They mentioned Wilhelm Reich, Annie Sprinkle.
Exactly. The whole sexual revolution idea wasn't just about, free love for its own sake. It was also about pushing back against really ingrained restrictive social norms,
Yeah.
fighting political oppression in some cases.
Gay pride movements.
That's a powerful example the sources use, reclaiming and celebrating marginalized sexualities as a form of resistance, exercising personal freedom.
And then there's this almost spiritual angle, or transcendent aspect. Some theorists, like Maffesoli, view the orgy as a force that cements sociality, lets individuals lose itself in an ensemble more vast. That sounds pretty intense.
It does sound intense, and the source is careful to caution that the historical proof for many of those accounts is shaky.
Okay.
But the basic idea that intense group experiences, including erotic ones, can create a powerful sense of collective identity, even transcendence, that's a theme you see across cultures and history. That concept of a regenerative breakdown of social order, as Eliade called it, it suggests a potentially transformative role for these kinds of collective moments, even if it's controversial.
I was also really intrigued by this idea of playdar, that
Yeah.
kind of intuition, being able to recognize others who might be into alternative sexual practices through subtle cues, verbal, nonverbal. It's like a secret language.
It's a fascinating kind of social intelligence, isn't it?
Yeah.
A heightened awareness of those little signals that suggest shared interests or identity within a subculture. Not mind reading, obviously, but being really tuned in.
And the role of ritual
Yeah.
and coded conduct in group sex, like the example of spouse exchange among American lifestylers. They have these distinct phases:
Yeah.
preparation, participation, then rejuvenation of the couple bond afterwards.
Yes, that really underscores the organized nature we talked about earlier. Ritualization is vital for managing the potential anxieties, the complexities.
How so?
Well, it gives a structure, a framework for navigating the experience. It helps people integrate or maybe separate these transgressive activities from their normal everyday lives. That emphasis in swinging on reassuring each other, actively maintaining the main relationship, that's a perfect example of that ritualized approach,
And finally, the idea that for some people, group sex is almost like a hobby
right?
where they build real friendships, a sense of community alongside the sex itself. That seems to, I don't know, humanize it beyond just the physical act.
Absolutely. For lots of participants, it's not only about the sex, it's deeply connected with building real bonds with people who get it, forming friendships, finding a sense of belonging in a community with shared interests and values. The fact that some swingers go to each other's weddings, funerals, that really says something about how deep those connections can run.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The sources also got into the psychological side, especially around disgust, shame, guilt connected to sexuality. These feel like really fundamental emotions that shape our attitudes.
Oh, definitely. Freud called them mental dams, didn't he? Related to our orifices, bodily functions. But what's really interesting is how those very emotions, the inhibitors, can also get tangled up with arousal.
How do you mean?
Well, the act of transgressing a taboo, something culturally or personally off limits, can itself become exciting for some people.
The simple example given was a tongue in the mouth, right? How it can be intimate pleasure or repulsive, depending entirely on the relationship, the context.
Exactly. And that anecdote about the therapist asking troubled couples to kiss with tongue for 5 minutes and they react with yuck.
Yeah.
It just shows how even in established relationships, that those deep-seated disgust rules can still operate.
Yeah.
And consciously overcoming those rules in specific situations with trust that can actually heighten arousal. It's about pushing boundaries personally and maybe socially.
William Miller's point about semen often being seen as polluting, and then this niche genre of gonzo porn involving fluid ingestion, that's definitely pushing boundaries to the extreme.
It is. It's challenging limits, exploring taboos head on.
It's fascinating how stuff we're taught is, like, inherently gross can become erotically charged for some.
It really speaks to that human drive to confront our ideas of purity, contamination, and the huge range of reactions to that kind of content. Intense arousal for some, total disgust for others, just highlights how subjective and culturally shaped these feelings are.
And then the total flip side. Those ritualized homosexuality practices in some Papua New Guinea cultures, where vaginal fluids were seen as polluting, but semen was considered essential for boys to become men, for transferring life force.
Exactly. A complete reversal of common Western ideas. It vividly shows how culture-specific our beliefs about bodies and sex really are.
Wow.
In those specific cultures, those secret semen rituals were central to male identity, to the whole social order. Heterosexual contact might have been viewed with more anxiety. It just shows how deeply these beliefs are woven into a culture's whole way of seeing the world, their cosmology.
It all seems to come back to this widespread preference for sexual privacy in many places, doesn't it?
It does.
But like the sources said, what it actually means to be caught in the act and what happens next, that varies hugely depending on the culture or the beliefs involved.
Precisely. Feelings about nakedness, the complex symbols we attach to the body, the uses to which it is assigned. These are all really emotional things that shape our varying needs for privacy and our strong reactions to being observed during sex.
Okay, another really key thing that came through was power dynamics. Within group sex, BDSM was mentioned as one really explicit way these exchanges happen in groups.
Yeah, BDSM gives a very clear framework for exploring power, consensually and often, very ritually. The examples mention bondage, controlled pain, dominance, humiliation, collaborative fantasy. They show all the different ways power can be negotiated, exchanged, performed in groups.
And the dramatization of inequalities, using specific cultural narratives like Nazi Jew or master-slave role plays, that adds another layer.
A significant layer of complexity, yes.
Yep.
These aren't just random acts. They often draw on powerful, sometimes disturbing historical or social narratives to structure the power play.
And then you have things like circuit parties, described as intensely sexualized events tied to pleasure, social connection, especially in the gay community. Even if not everyone is having sex on the dance floor, the whole atmosphere is charged, right?
Yes, circuit parties deliberately cultivate that specific kind of heightened erotic energy. Through hours of dancing, maybe drug use for some, and the implicit, sometimes explicit goal of finding sexual encounters.
And their social importance.
Hugely important.
Yeah.
Especially as social and cultural spaces for gay men. Offering community, belonging, celebration. Particularly as a reaction against homophobia and discrimination. They're vital spaces for many.
That Coolidge effect idea popped up again here too, didn't it? Novelty via different partners helping maintain interest in group sex scenarios. Seems like a consistent theme.
It does. Introducing new partners, employing new dynamics or roles in a group, it can definitely work against habituation, keep arousal and interest going over time for some people.
And sources also included some really personal accounts. People finding group sex arousing for lots of different reasons.
Right.
Just feeling desired by multiple people, or the shared intimacy with a partner in that setting, or just the thrill of breaking norms.
Exactly. It really highlights how diverse and deeply personal the motivations can be.
Yeah.
There's no single reason why someone finds group sex fulfilling or arousing. It's often a complex mix. Personal desires, relationship dynamics, the specific context of the encounter itself.
Then the conversation shifted to online platforms, like Craigslist playing a big role in facilitating anonymous encounters, group sex arrangements. That brings in different factors, right? Mystery, maybe more risk.
It does. Anonymity online can be a huge draw for people wanting to explore less conventional sex, including group sex. That element of mystery, the potential to maybe escalate the intensity, that can be really arousing for some.
But the sources were also really clear about the risks, the complexities of meeting people online, that male sex deficit you often see on platforms.
Yeah, more men looking than women, often.
The spammers, the sex workers, just the general uncertainty about who you're really meeting, what their intentions are.
Those are very real, very significant concerns. The online world for anonymous sex can be, well, unfortunately, full of deception, potential danger. It's crucial for people navigating those spaces to be extremely cautious, really aware that things might not be what they seem.
And finally, sex addiction came up. Its potential link to seeking riskier or more intense experiences, like group sex. It's still kind of controversial, though, right? Whether it's a real addiction.
It is indeed complex, still actively debated. The broader idea of behavioral addictions is getting more traction, yes, in psychology, medicine. But applying addiction specifically to sex, some professionals still contest that.
But people do use the term.
Oh, yes. The sources acknowledge many individuals and therapists use the term. They use it to describe patterns of sexual thoughts, behaviors that feel excessive, inappropriate, destructive, and seem to need professional help. That constant urge to escalate, seek more intense or risky experiences like group sex, can sometimes be part of those problematic patterns for some individuals.
Okay, so, wow. We've really gone deep into this whole world of group sex. The historical misuses, the diverse ways it happens today, the motivations, the psychology. What are the big takeaways here? What should we really remember from all this?
I think the main thing is just recognizing the complexity. Group sex is absolutely not monolithic. It's been used politically, strategically, throughout history.
Right.
It exists in surprisingly organized ways today. And it's driven by this huge, diverse range of individual and social factors, the sensational stories we usually hear. They tend to completely obscure the nuanced, often quite structured reality.
Yeah, it's clear there's so much more going on than just chaotic abandon. And you've got these intricate social structures, deep personal motivations, powerful psychological dynamics, all shaping these experiences in ways we might not expect.
Exactly. And really understanding the complexity means we have to move past simple moral judgments, right? And instead try to engage with how history, social norms, personal desire, psychology,
Yeah.
how they all interact to shape human sexual behavior in all its variety.
So, maybe a final thought for everyone listening to really chew on. Given how sexual accusations have been used historically as a tool of control, and considering all the varied personal meanings and motivations people find in group sex today, how do we navigate our own understanding of consensual, non-normative sex? How do we balance individual freedom with social responsibility, with a critical eye on those power dynamics?
That's the question, isn't it?
What unseen forces might still be shaping how we perceive and judge these activities is definitely something to keep thinking about.